Get back to our top line conversation. That Manulife survey finding that a significant proportion of Canadian households stretched a little too thin to handle a financial shock. Joining us for more is Jeffrey Schwartz, Executive Director at Consolidated Credit Counseling Services of Canada. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So I don't imagine in the business that you're in, credit counseling services, that you're very shocked by these results, that there's households out there that just couldn't withstand any rise in payments, that they're barely making ends meet at all.
You know what? It's not a surprise. This has been happening for years, and the messages have been, well, get your financial house in order so that if and when interest rates do rise, you can handle that shock.
When you see people in your line of business and they come in, and obviously they've been feeding on that cheap debt, people have this, I know from talking to people, they don't think it's going to change. Even though we saw interest rates get a little steeper in the wake of a Trump presidency, they still think we're in a low rate environment for a long time. How do you get that out of people's minds? Like, you just can't keep borrowing, that the situation is going to change.
Well, you know what? That is a big struggle, and unless they've been faced with some sort of crisis, and I think that's where probably our conversation should go, is that, you know, even if the interest rates rise a little bit, many Canadians, in fact, probably most people, are going to be able to handle a little rise. But the big concern is the fact that not necessarily about a rise in interest rates, but what if their income changes? So what if they get a reduction in hours? What if they lose their job? Are they going to be able to weather the storm? And I think this study addresses some of that.
Yeah, that was the big one that really jumped out to me, the fact that if the primary wage earner in the home lost their job, and perhaps not surprising that if people are barely making ends meet, if that income is gone, you're going to have a lot of trouble in just a few months. But I guess that goes back to proper planning. If you're in that situation, you can't weather the storm for 3 to 6 months, you're not putting enough money aside for an emergency.
Yeah, and it's almost like a whole generation has missed this. We look back in the 70s and the 80s, and people were saving in the high teens, almost 20%. Now that number is below 5%. So to address what you're talking about, no one has any savings, or very few people have savings that would allow them to last even 3 to 6 months. So if they do lose one paycheck, they're going to be in trouble, and they're going to be concerned about making ends meet.
I wonder sometimes when you hear about people not saving, and obviously it's not prudent to not be putting money aside, but in the 70s and particularly the 80s, when interest rates were so high, saving was actually sort of enticing. It was attractive. You put money in the bank, you put money into an investment vehicle, you could actually see some return. Now you're not seeing any money from saving, and meanwhile, there's a big pile of cheap cash. I know it's the wrong mindset to be in, but I think that's where people have their heads stuck.
It's exactly where people have their heads stuck, and we're seeing a lot of the marketers going after those people and instant gratification, buying all the time and not putting some of that money away, not looking at, well, do they really need the item that they're buying, or is it just a want, and then taking that money and putting it aside for a rainy day fund. And that's really going to help people, because life happens. I mean, a lot of the people that we see, it's really as a result of something going on in their lives, that they've had an unexpected expense, and now all of a sudden their bills have crept up and their debt has crept up so much. If one little shock in their income happens, they're going to be over the edge, and they're not going to be able to manage that debt.
Now, the first and simple step seems to be create a budget for yourself. I'd be shocked if a household didn't have one, but I know from talking to people, a lot of people are just sort of rolling with the good times. You have to really lay out your expenses and see where the money's going.
Create a budget, set a goal, and in most cases it's pay off debt, but in some cases it could be vacation planning. Once you've set that goal, do everything you can to eliminate discretionary costs or wants from your budget so that you can accomplish that goal. But really, this is all real simple stuff, but it's not necessarily easy. And if you need help, seek a credit counselor or a trusted advisor to kind of hold your hand throughout the process.
Now, in terms of the kind of people you see, when it breaks down by demographics, I'm curious if you see many millennials. I mean, obviously they're just starting out and maybe they haven't entered a position where things have gone wrong for them. But I found it interesting in this Manulife report that I think it was more than a third of them think that interest rates are too high right now. If they think these are high rates, I don't know how they're going to handle any normalized rates.
Well, it's that generational thing. I mean, when I was young, we did see huge interest rates, and my parents managing their mortgage, et cetera. I mean, they were looking at in the teens in terms of what it was costing them to have debt. So they really didn't want any debt. Now, it's not a big deal for these millennials, but even anything is probably over the edge for them. I think they have a different attitude towards money than our generation or my parents' generation did.
Because money's always been cheap for them.
That's right. That's right, and they can manage their minimum payment on their credit card. Or even still, they're not even carrying a ton of debt, and as a result, it's not a big issue for them. But you know what? What happens if they don't have the income that they want to support their lifestyle? Then it's going to become a big issue for them.
I believe that was another finding of the report too, where you mentioned people carrying balances on their credit card. That can get you in a dangerous situation because there's different borrowing vehicles, but some people are paying, even in a low interest rate environment, you're paying high teens, maybe even more than 20% on a credit card balance. That just isn't smart.
Well, it's what I call the forever and ever plan. I mean, the minimum payments are set up such that you're really only going to cover interest. I mean, very little of it's going to paying off the debt. And if you can figure that you're being successful in managing your bills just by paying the minimum, you really got to think again, because it's not a great financial strategy. And ultimately, unless your income increases, it's likely going to catch up with you.
Now, I would hate to think that we would advise people to take on more debt to take care of debt, but I know there is a school of thought that if you have a lot of high interest credit debt, maybe if you have a different vehicle to borrow and pay that off is a part of a strategy. Maybe you just can't get rid of it all with the cash that you have, but don't be paying that 19-20% every month.
That's mathematics.
Yeah.
Essentially, you're just making your dollar work efficiently for you, but there's some dangers associated with that, especially if you're taking on secured debt to pay off unsecured debt, and then you go offside on that secured debt, then you potentially lose the collateral. And in many cases, it's putting your house under pressure because that's what they secure it against.
In terms of your practice, would it be fair to say the number one problem that people get into is when they do lose that job? I mean, that's the most important thing. Canadians want to make good on their debt obligations, but if you don't have an income, it gets tough.
That's what we're seeing right now, especially in this low interest rate environment, because it is easy to manage from day to day. But when we look at the oil patch as an example, I mean, I believe the number on the last insolvency rate was up 30% year over year. And essentially, that's what's happening. People have stretched themselves so thin, they're carrying so much debt that even with a small amount of income or no income, they can't manage that anymore, and they don't have the savings to be able to pay off that debt.
It's an important discussion. I'm glad you're here to have it with us. That was Jeffrey Schwartz, Executive Director at Consolidated Credit Counseling Services of Canada.